On the north face of Bearpin Hollow, where the old hardwood canopy grew so thick that direct sun never once reached the ground even at high noon in the deepest part of summer, Keziah Renshaw knelt in 6 inches of black leaf mold, worked a narrow iron digging hoe gently around a gnarled, forked root, and eased it whole out of the cold earth into her open palm. Down at the fence line below her, 2 men from the valley had reined in their mules to watch, and the taller of them, a farmer named Jubal Creech, who worked the good bottomland on the sunny side of the ridge, called out loud enough to carry all the way up the slope that Ephraim Renshaw's girl had finally gone soft in the head, up on her knees in the dirt grubbing weeds off a hillside that wouldn't grow a stalk of corn if the Lord himself came down with a plow and a team of oxen to help her. Keziah did not look up, and she did not stop working the hoe free of the soil around the next root in the row. She had heard some version of that same joke, in some man's voice or another, more times that autumn than she cared to count, and she had long since stopped finding it worth the trouble of an answer. What Jubal Creech did not know, sitting his mule at that fence rail with his breath steaming in the cold morning air, was that the sack resting open against her knee was not her first of that season, and would not be her last, and that every gnarled root he was laughing at was worth, ounce for ounce, more than anything either Creech brother had ever pulled out of their own rich bottom ground. She had spent the better part of a year learning exactly what that shaded, sunless, supposedly worthless hillside was actually worth. It had very nearly cost her everything to learn it, and it would take the rest of this story told properly and from its true beginning to show you how. If you enjoy a true-to-craft frontier story where the numbers finally do the arguing for themselves, stay through this one to the end. Tap the like button before you go on, and tell me down in the comments what part of the country or the world you're watching this from tonight, because I do read every one of them. Now let's go back to the winter her father died, because that winter, and not this one, is where this story actually begins. Ephraim Renshaw had held 113 acres on Bearpin Hollow for the better part of 30 years, a narrow, folded piece of Cade County ground that ran up out of a small creek and climbed the mountain in 2 directions at once, a modest stretch of sun-warmed bottomland along the water itself, no more than 3 acres in all, and then, behind and above it, more than 100 acres of steep, north-facing timber that had never once, in 30 years, grown anything a man could sell. The bottomland was the only ground on the place that had ever mattered to anyone. It grew good corn in a wet year and passable corn in a dry one, and every fall Ephraim Renshaw had carried what he could spare of it down to Thaddeus Pemberton's store at the crossroads called Tanyard Forks, where it was weighed and credited against whatever the family owed on the books, the way nearly every small farm in that end of the county settled its accounts. The hollow above the bottomland, the north-facing slope that climbed away from the creek into old, untouched hardwood, was a different matter entirely. It was steep enough in places that a man had to hold on to a sapling to keep his footing, and the canopy overhead, old sugar maple and buckeye and yellow poplar and beech, trees no one had ever cut because no sane man would try to farm ground that steep, kept the forest floor in a permanent green twilight even in the brightest part of July. Nothing that mattered to a Cade County farmer would grow under that shade. No corn, no cane, no pasture grass worth grazing a cow on. The county had a name for ground like that, spoken usually with a shake of the head: shade land, dead land, ground that ate a man's labor and gave nothing back for it. Ephraim Renshaw had never tried to farm it. He had simply let it stand, cut a little firewood from its edges most winters, and otherwise left the 100 acres of hollow to the deer and the wild turkey and whatever grew there on its own account, the way his own father had left it before him. She remembered, walking the hollow's edge in the gray days after the frost that would nearly finish her that fall. One particular evening from her girlhood, when her father had stood at that same fence line with her, pointing out a black bear's fresh tracks crossing toward the deep timber, and had told her, in the offhand way, a tired man talks to a child mostly to hear his own thoughts out loud, that there was more growing wild under those old trees than most folks in the valley ever troubled themselves to learn the names of, and that a person could go hungry her whole life standing in the middle of plenty she had never bothered to look at closely. She had been 9 or 10 at the time, and had thought he meant the chestnuts, or maybe the huckleberries that grew thick along the upper ridge, and it was not until she was 28 and kneeling in that same leaf mold with $52 standing between her and everything he had left her that she understood, all at once, that he might have meant something else entirely and had simply never lived long enough or found reason enough to say so plainly. Keziah had lived her whole life on that mountain and had never once, before that September, given the North Hollow more thought than her father had given it. She had been the youngest of Ephraim Renshaw's 4 children and the only one who had never much minded the isolation of the place. Her brother and both her sisters had married down into the flatter, more sociable country around Morganton as soon as they were old enough to manage it, while Keziah had stayed on through her 20s, first because her mother's health had needed the extra hands, and then, after her mother died, because her father's had. And she had told herself often enough across those years that she did not mind the quiet and the distance, and the particular loneliness of a farm 2 hours' hard walk from the nearest neighbor likely to call on her, that she had mostly stopped noticing whether the telling was still true. She missed her father more in the weeks after the frost than she had let herself miss him in the raw days right after the funeral, when there had been too much sudden, practical work to leave room for grief. It was standing in his ruined cornfield, she thought later, that she had first actually understood he was gone. He had died in February of that year, quickly and without much warning, of a lung fever that had gone around the whole upper end of the county that winter and had already carried off 2 other men she had known her entire life. He left Keziah, 28 years old, unmarried, the only one of his children still living at home, the full 113 acres outright, along with a note at Pemberton's store that had been quietly growing through his last hard year, when he had been too sick, too often, to work the bottomland the way it needed working. The note stood at $58 even, the sum of 2 winters' credit for flour and salt and coffee and the doctor's calls that hadn't saved him in the end, and Thaddeus Pemberton, not an unkind man in the ordinary run of things, but a careful one, had told her plainly, standing behind his own counter with his ledger open between them, that he expected it settled in full by the 15th of December, the same date the note had always carried, going back to the day her father first signed it, and that he could extend no further grace on it beyond that day on account of a man in his own position owing debts of his own that came due on a schedule he did not control. Keziah had nodded, written the figure and the date into her own small ledger in her own careful hand, the way she wrote down everything that mattered, and walked home to a farm that had, on paper, exactly 1 way of raising $58 by the middle of December, the 3 acres of creek bottom, planted as heavily and as carefully as she knew how, and sold off through the fall the same way her father always had. She had planted that bottomland in corn that spring with more care than she had ever given anything in her life. She turned the soil twice. She carried manure down from the barn in a wheelbarrow, load after load, until her hands blistered and then calloused over and stopped blistering. She thinned the rows by hand, on her knees, checking each stalk, and she walked the fence line most evenings after the day's other work was done, simply to look at it, the way a woman looks at the one thing standing between her and losing everything her father had spent 30 years building. By the last week of August, the corn stood shoulder-high and heavy-eared, and Keziah had begun, cautiously, to let herself believe that this single terrifying year might end the way it was supposed to end, with the note paid and the farm still hers and nothing more remarkable to show for it than a good ordinary harvest brought in by a woman working alone. The frost came on the 3rd night of September, nearly 6 weeks earlier than any frost anyone in that end of Cade County could remember, A hard, still, cloudless cold that dropped out of a clear sky with no warning at all and left every low place in the valley white by morning. Keziah walked down to the bottomland before full daylight, already knowing from the bite in the air what she would find, and stood at the edge of the field for a long time, looking at 3 acres of corn gone black and collapsed in a single night, the leaves hanging in limp, frost-killed ribbons, the ears inside their shucks stopped dead, weeks short of the hard, dry kernels that would have carried real weight on Pemberton's scale. She salvaged what she could over the following days, husking out whatever had gotten far enough along to be worth anything at all, and the final count, when she finished and wrote it into her ledger with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to, came to a little under 6 bushels fit only for hog feed, out of a crop that should have made better than 40. 40 bushels of good corn would have cleared the note at Pemberton's store with money left over for the winter. 6 bushels of frost-damaged feed corn would not clear $10 of it. Keziah sat at her kitchen table that night with the ledger open in front of her and did the arithmetic 3 separate times, the way she did every hard sum 3 times before she trusted it, and each time it came out the same. $58 owed, $52 still needed by the 15th of December, and, as far as she could see sitting at that table in the last week of a ruined September, no honest way on the whole 113 acres of Bearpen Hollow to raise it. It was 2 days after the frost, walking the boundary of the useless North Hollow more out of restlessness than any real purpose, that she noticed the plants properly for the first time in her life. Not the way she had glanced past them 1,000 times before while cutting firewood or chasing a stray hog through the undergrowth, but really noticed them, the way a person notices a thing only once she has a reason to. They grew scattered through the deep leaf mold under the old maples and buckeyes, a low plant with 3 or 4 stems fanning out from a single stalk, each stem ending in a cluster of 5-toothed leaflets, and at the center of the older, larger plants, a tight cluster of berries had gone a deep, waxy red in the last of the year's warmth. She remembered her father once calling the plant by a name she had half forgotten. Sang, he'd called it, or sang, in the clipped mountain way of saying it. And she remembered him saying years before, in an offhand way she had never thought to ask more about, that old Eli Sartain up the mountain had made real money off that root once, back before she was grown. She did not know, kneeling in the leaf mold that afternoon with a handful of the red-berried plants in front of her, and $52 standing between her and the whole of what her father had left her, whether that half-remembered scrap of a story was worth anything at all. But it was the only thread she had left to pull on. And so, the next morning, she walked the better part of 4 miles up the mountain to find out. Eli Sartain lived alone in a 2-room cabin near the head of Sable Fork, a good 2 hours' climb above the last cleared farm in that part of the county, in a hollow so remote that most of Cade County had half forgotten he was still living up there at all. He was somewhere past 70, a small, spare, weathered man with a white beard cropped close and hands so deeply lined and stained brown at the knuckles that Keziah found herself, without quite meaning to, staring at them while he looked over the plants she had carried up the mountain wrapped in a wet cloth. He had buried a wife of his own more than 40 years before, up in the little fenced plot behind his cabin, and had raised 2 sons who had long since gone west and did not write often, and he had dug ginseng on that mountain, on and off, for the better part of 60 years, since he was a boy younger than Keziah's own youngest brother had been when he left home. He told her a little of that history while they walked back down the mountain together, in the unhurried way he seemed to tell most things, only once and without much invitation to ask follow-up questions. He had dug his first root at 9 years old, alongside his own father, on ground 2 ridges over that had since passed out of his family's hands entirely, and had used his own share of 1 good autumn's digging, saved over 4 years, to buy the very acres his cabin now stood on, back before Keziah's father was more than a boy himself. His father had told him, and his father's father before that. The old stories that still moved up and down the mountain about Daniel Boone. Dead now the better part of 30 years, but remembered on that ridge mostly as a Ginseng man before he was remembered as anything else, who was said to have lost a whole flatboat's worth of cured root, a small fortune by any digger's reckoning, when the boat went under crossing the Ohio on its way to market. Man could tame half a continent and still lose everything to one bad river crossing, Eli said, not unkindly, more as a fact of the trade than as any particular warning. Root's not cursed. It's only that the getting of money out of a mountain has never once in my whole life come free of some kind of risk to a body willing to take it on. Sang, he said, turning one of the plants over in his palm and nodding slowly, the way a man nods at an old acquaintance. Your daddy was right to remember the name, even if he never troubled himself to dig it. Ephraim always did have better sense for corn than for what was growing under his own trees. He said it without any particular unkindness, the way he seemed to say most things, and Keziah found she did not mind it from him the way she minded it from Jubal Creech at the fence rail. He walked her back down to Bearpen Hollow that same afternoon, moving through the steep timber with an ease that made her 28 years old and thought of by most of the county as strong for a woman, work hard to keep pace with him, and he showed her, kneeling in her own leaf mold not 30 yards from where Jubal Creech would one day laugh at her from the fence line below, exactly what she was looking for and exactly what she was not. "Count the prongs," he told her, laying one hand flat beside a small plant with only 2 stems forking up from its base. "1 prong, 2 prong. That's a baby. Give it years yet. Some folks dig it anyway, and that's how a mountain gets dug clean out inside of one man's lifetime, which I have lived long enough now to watch happen twice already." He moved his hand to a larger plant a few feet further on, one with 3 full stems, each fanned into 5 small toothed leaves, a single stalk rising from its center, topped with the cluster of deep red berries Keziah had noticed 2 days before. 3 prongs old enough to bear seed, like this one's doing right now. 4 prongs better yet, bigger root, more years of growing behind it, and a buyer down at the settlement will pay you more of a difference for that extra year than you'd think reasonable. If you ever get the chance to sell to a buyer who knows what he's looking at, which is not a thing I would trust to Thaddeus Pemberton on his own account. God love him. He pointed out, while they were still kneeling there, the other plants that tended to keep company with sang on ground like this, a low, dark-leaved spread of what he called black cohosh a few feet further up the slope, and closer to the little seep running through the bottom of the cove, the pale, deeply lobed leaves of bloodroot already gone dormant for the season. Learn what grows alongside it, and you'll learn to spot the ground worth walking slow over before you ever spot the plant itself, he told her. Sang doesn't grow just anywhere shade falls. It wants rich, old ground, the kind that's had leaves falling on it undisturbed longer than either of us has been alive. You'll start reading the whole hollow different once you know what to look for. He showed her the root itself next, working the soil away from the 3-pronged plant with a narrow, sharpened stick he carried for the purpose, patient in a way that made the work look easier than Keziah would find it was over the weeks that followed, when she tried it herself. The root came free whole, pale, and forked into 2 thick legs beneath a slightly wrinkled neck, and Eli held it up in the gray afternoon light for her to see properly. Some folks call it man root, on account of it growing shaped like this, arms and legs both, if you're lucky and careful digging it, he said. Break a leg off getting it out of the ground and you've just thrown away near half of what it was worth to somebody standing on the far side of an ocean who is going to pay real silver for a whole one and next to nothing for a broken one. Dig slow. Dig wide of the root before you dig close to it. Never force it. He handed it to her to hold, and Keziah turned the strange little forked thing over in her fingers, faintly astonished that anything growing wild and unwanted on her father's worthless hillside could be worth the care he was describing. Then he showed her the last, and he told her plainly, the most important part of the whole business. The part that separated a digger who meant to still be digging that same hollow 10 years on from one who would dig it bare in 2 seasons and have nothing left to show for the third. He stripped the ripe red berries from the top of the 3-pronged stalk, 4 small berries in all, split one open with his thumbnail to show her the pale seed inside, and then knelt and pressed all 4 berries, whole, into the loosened soil exactly where the root had come out, covering them lightly with the same black leaf mold he had just dug through. "Every root you take, you put its own seed back in the ground before you leave that spot," he said. "That seed won't come up for a year, maybe 2, and it won't bear a root worth digging for the better part of 10 years after that. But it will come up if the shade holds and nothing roots it out of the ground first, and 10 years from now some digger, might be you, might be somebody you've taught yourself, is going to kneel down in this exact spot and find a plant here that wouldn't exist at all if you hadn't taken the 2 minutes it costs to do this." He looked up at her, his pale eyes steady under thick white brows. "Man dug this whole mountain clean 40 years back, over on the Tennessee side, digging everything he found and never once putting a seed back. There's a name folks still use for ground like that. They call it dug out. Whole mountain dug out, like a tooth pulled and never filled back in. I don't aim to leave Bearpin Hollow that way, and if you're going to work it, neither do you." Keziah spent the rest of that short afternoon working beside him, digging her first dozen roots under his eye, while he corrected her grip on the digging stick, made her start over twice when she rushed a root and nearly snapped a leg off it, and showed her, patient as a man with nowhere else in the world he needed to be, the particular quiet, deliberate rhythm of the work. Find the plant, count the prongs, look for the berries, dig wide, dig slow, lift the whole root clean, press the seed back into the same disturbed ground before moving on. By the time the light began to fail under the heavy canopy, she had 11 roots wrapped in her apron, her knees soaked through with cold leaf mold, and a soreness across her shoulders she suspected she would carry for days, and she felt, for the first time since the frost had taken her corn, something closer to hope than to simple desperation. She asked him, walking him partway back up the mountain track before he would let her turn home, what she owed him for the afternoon, and for whatever more of his time she would need to ask for in the weeks ahead, because she had learned from her father never to accept a man's labor without accounting for it honestly in her ledger. Eli Sarton considered the question for a long moment, the way he seemed to consider most questions, and told her that what he wanted, when the time came, was first pick of seed off her own patch, once she had one worth calling a patch because his own knees were not what they had been 40 years before, and he would rather teach a patch into being than keep climbing this mountain alone to dig one out of the wild for the rest of whatever years he had left. He admitted to her, too, walking her partway down, that neither of his own 2 sons had ever cared much for the work, even as boys, and that both had gone west chasing land of their own rather than staying to learn a mountain either of them had grown up walking. He did not say it with any particular bitterness, only the plain, settled regret of an old man who had spent 60 years learning something worth knowing and had begun to wonder before that September whether he would ever get the chance to hand the whole of it on to somebody willing to actually keep it. Keziah wrote the arrangement down, too, in her own way, though it was not the kind of debt that fit neatly into a column of figures. He told her one more thing before they parted that first evening, standing at the fork in the trail where his path climbed on and hers dropped back down toward the house, that the digging season on that mountain ran from the time the berries turned red, same as she'd found them, on through the fall until the ground froze too hard to work a hoe into it, and that whatever she meant to gather that year, she would need to gather and start curing well before the deep cold came, because a root left in frozen ground was a root she would not get back out again until spring, by which time the buyers would be long gone from the settlement stores and would not come through again until the following autumn. Keziah did the arithmetic in her head as she walked home in the last of the light. Not quite 3 months, by Eli's reckoning, to dig, cure, grade, and sell enough root to raise $52, on a hillside nobody else in Cade County thought was worth walking up. Word that Ephraim Renshaw's daughter had taken up grubbing roots on the worthless side of her own mountain reached Tanyard Forks inside of a week, the way anything worth laughing at in Cade County always seemed to travel faster than anything worth admiring. Keziah heard the first open mockery of it standing at the counter of Thaddeus Pemberton's store on a Saturday morning in the third week of September, where she had walked the 4 miles down from Bearpin Hollow to trade a little butter and eggs for coffee and salt, and to ask, carefully, whether Pemberton might extend her even a week or two past the 15th of December, given the corn. Pemberton was a heavy-set, careful man of about 50, not unkind by nature, but a man who kept his own books close and trusted almost nothing he had not personally weighed, measured, or witnessed. And he heard her question out with his ledger already open on the counter between them, the page bearing her father's note turned to face her, the figure $58 and the date the 15th of December written in his own square hand, exactly where they had always been written. "I extended your father grace more than once these last 2 winters, Miss Renshaw, on account of I respected him, and because a sick man's note is a different thing from a note gone simply unpaid," he said. "But I have my own accounts due in Morganton on the 1st of January, same as every year, and I cannot carry your $58 past the 15th of December and still meet mine. I am sorry for the frost. I truly am. But sorry does not settle a ledger." It was Jubal Creech, leaning against the counter's far end, waiting on his own turn with a sack of nails, who asked her, loud enough for the 4 or 5 other men in the store to hear plainly, whether the rumor was true that she'd taken to digging weeds on the shade side of her hollow to make up the difference. "Sang," she told him evenly, because she had decided already, walking down the mountain that morning, that she would not be ashamed of the word in front of him or anyone else. "Wild ginseng. There's a fair stand of it on the north slope, and I mean to dig and cure what I can before the ground freezes." The store went for a moment, nearly as quiet as it had gone the day an auctioneer once read a bid back to a man twice over because he thought he'd misheard the number, and then Creech laughed outright, and 2 of the other men laughed with him, and even Pemberton, closing his ledger with a small, tired shake of his head, allowed that he had heard of mountain folk making a little pocket money off wild roots in a good year, the way a body might make a little money off huckleberries or chestnuts, but that he had never in his life heard of anyone proposing to pay off a $58 note with it, and did not expect he was about to start believing in the notion now on Keziah Renshaw's say-so alone. "Roots and weeds," Creech said, still grinning, wiping his eyes with the back of one hand. "Ephraim's girl is going to save the home place by grubbing roots and weeds off the one hillside on it that never grew a thing worth a plow in 30 years. I'd pay money myself to see that ledger balance." His companion at the counter, a younger man Keziah did not know well, added that he supposed a woman living alone up at the head of a hollow had to find some way to pass the winter evenings. And the way he said it, with a sideways look at the other men rather than at her, carried an ugliness under the joke that had nothing to do with corn or with roots at all. And Keziah felt the heat come up in her face before she could stop it. Not everyone in the store that morning joined the laughter. Winnie Ledford, who kept house 2 farms down from Pemberton's Crossroads and had known Keziah's mother before either of them were married, stood near the dry goods shelves through the whole exchange without saying a word, and caught Keziah's eye once, briefly, on her way out the door, with a look that was not quite sympathy and not quite anything else Keziah could easily name. Something closer, she thought later, to the particular attention one careful, overworked woman sometimes pays another without any promise attached to it, only of having noticed. It was not much. Keziah told herself walking home that it should not have mattered to her as much as it did. One silent look set against the open laughter of 6 men she had known her whole life. But she found she carried that look up the mountain with her more carefully than she carried anything Jubal Creech had said, and thought of it again more than once on the harder mornings that followed. She did not answer either man that morning. She paid for her coffee and her salt with the little cash she had left, thanked Pemberton for hearing her out even though he had refused her, and walked out of Tanyard Forks with her chin level and her basket on her arm, and she did not let herself cry until she was a full mile up the mountain track, alone, where none of them could see her do it. She wrote the whole exchange into her ledger that evening anyway, the refusal and the date and the balance still owed, the same as she wrote down everything, because Eli Sartain had told her that first afternoon on the mountain that a digger who kept an honest count of what she'd taken out of the ground and what she'd put back into it was a digger who would still be believed. Eventually, whatever anybody standing in a store laughing at her happened to believe in the meantime. $58 owed. 87 days left until the 15th of December. 11 roots dug so far. None yet cured. None yet worth a single cent to anyone. She closed the ledger, banked the fire, and was back up on the North Hollow with her digging hoe before full light the next morning. The digging itself settled, over the next several weeks, into a rhythm Keziah came to know in her hands and her knees before she ever fully articulated it to herself in words. She rose before light, did the milking and the ordinary chores a small farm demanded, regardless of what else a woman had on her mind that season, and then climbed the North Hollow with her digging hoe, a sack folded under one arm, and a square of oilcloth to kneel on that saved her skirts, if not her knees, from the worst of the cold, wet leaf mold. She learned to read the hollow the way Eli had first read it for her. The richest ground lay in the coves where the old maples and buckeyes stood thickest, and the leaf mold had built up black and deep and undisturbed, probably, she came to believe, for longer than her father had owned the place at all. She learned to spot a stand of sang from 20 feet off by the particular fan of its 5-leaflet prongs against the duller understory around it, to walk past the 1- and 2-prong plants without breaking her stride, the way Eli had taught her, and to kneel only at the 3- and 4-prong plants, checking first for the telltale cluster of berries, gone from green to a deepening red as September wore into October, before she ever put the hoe to the ground around them. The digging itself was slower work than she had expected that first week, and grew faster only as her hands learned exactly how much soil a given root needed cleared before it would lift free without breaking. She dug wide of the plant, the way Eli had shown her, working the hoe in a loose circle a full hand's width out from the visible stem before working inward, easing the soil away rather than tearing it, feeling for the moment when the whole forked shape of the root came loose from the earth around it, rather than forcing it before that moment arrived. She broke 3 roots badly enough to ruin them in her first 3 days working alone, each time feeling the small, specific disappointment of having cost herself real money through simple impatience, and by the end of the first week she had stopped breaking them at all, or nearly so. She kept the seed-planting part of the work exactly as faithfully as Eli had asked her to, pressing the ripe red berries from each stalk into the loosened ground where its root had come out, before she ever moved on to the next plant. Even on the coldest, most discouraging afternoons, when it would have been easy enough to tell herself that one skipped planting, this once, would not matter to anyone. She thought, more than once, kneeling in the failing light with cold, numbed fingers pressing a handful of berries into the dirt, that it was strange work for a woman racing a December deadline to be doing, planting a crop she would not live to dig for 10 years. On the same afternoons, she was trying to save a farm inside of 80 days. But she kept doing it anyway, because Eli had asked her to, and because some stubborn part of her had already decided, whatever happened with Pemberton's note, that she meant to still be digging this same hollow in 10 years, with something left in the ground to show for how she'd dug it the first time. The hollow changed around her through those weeks in ways she found herself watching more closely than she would have expected, given everything else crowding her mind that autumn. The old maples along the upper slope turned first, in the last days of September, a color so deep and sudden a gold that the whole cove seemed lit from within some mornings, even under a sky too overcast, to account for the light any other way. And Keziah found herself pausing more than once, kneeling over a half-dug root, simply to look at it before she remembered how little time she actually had to spare for looking. The Buckeyes turned next, a duller bronze, and dropped their smooth brown nuts thick enough across the leaf mold that she had to be careful some mornings, not to mistake one for the swelling top of a root she hadn't yet uncovered. By the middle of October, the whole hollow had gone the particular rust and amber color she remembered, distantly, her mother once calling the prettiest month God ever made for a body too poor to enjoy it properly. A saying Keziah had not understood as a girl and understood considerably better now, kneeling in it with a debt hanging over her head and finding, despite everything, that she could not entirely stop herself from noticing the beauty of the place she was so afraid of losing. She came in an odd way she had not expected when she first climbed the mountain to find Eli Sartain in September to actually love the work itself, apart from anything it might or might not end up being worth. There was a particular satisfaction, distinct from the arithmetic, in the moment a root came free of the ground whole and unbroken after 10 careful minutes of coaxing it loose, in the small private ceremony of pressing its seed back into the same disturbed earth, in watching her own sack grow heavier by careful ounces through a long, quiet, solitary morning with nothing for company but birdsong and the sound of her own hoe working through leaf mold. She had spent her whole life thinking of the North Hollow as the one part of her father's farm that had nothing to offer anybody, and she was learning, root by careful root, that she had simply never once been taught to look at it properly. By the second week of October, she had covered most of the richest coves on the lower half of the hollow and had begun working her way up into steeper ground that took her the better part of an hour simply to climb to, carrying her tools and an empty sack before she could begin digging at all. Her hands, soft at the start of September, had gone hard and brown and permanently rimmed with black earth under the nails, and she had lost, she guessed without much regret, most of whatever her mother would once have called a proper young lady's hands. She dug through a stretch of cold rain in the middle of the month that left her soaked through and shivering by mid-afternoon on 3 separate days, and she dug through one morning of hard frost, so bitter that the leaf mold crunched white and frozen under her knees until the sun, weak as it was on that shaded slope, finally softened it past noon. She kept the ledger faithfully through all of it, a running tally in her own hand of roots dug by the day, rough weight by the week once she began weighing the fresh, undried root on the kitchen scale each evening, a column of small numbers that meant nothing yet to anyone but her, because none of it had been cured, graded, or sold. And a man like Thaddeus Pemberton would look at a heap of dirty wet root and see, she suspected, exactly what Jubal Creech had already told the whole store he saw in it. But the column grew anyway, week over week, and some evenings, sitting at her kitchen table adding the day's weight into a running total that had reached, by the last week of October, past 40 pounds of fresh root not yet touched by a single day of curing, Keziah allowed herself something she had been careful not to allow herself since the morning of the frost. The plain, quiet, private conviction that the hillside her father had left standing untouched for 30 years was going to be worth more, by the time this was over, than every other acre he had ever owned. Eli climbed down from Sable Fork to check on her twice that October, unannounced both times, appearing at the edge of whatever cove she was working with no more ceremony than a nod, watching her dig 2 or 3 roots without comment before he corrected some small fault in her hoe work, or told her once that she had passed over a fine 4-pronged plant not 10 feet behind her because she had been looking too low to the ground and not carefully enough at the leaf pattern above it. He never stayed long, and he never once asked her how the note at Pemberton's stood, though she suspected he already knew the whole of it from someone in the settlement, and she found she was grateful, both for the correction and for the not asking. She startled a copperhead out of a pile of rotted deadfall in the second week of October, close enough that her heart did not slow properly for the better part of an hour afterward, and she gave up, after that, on kneeling in any leaf litter she had not first cleared away with the flat of her hoe, a habit Eli told her when she mentioned it to him she ought to have started with rather than learned the hard way, the same as most of the mountain's other lessons got learned. She dug on regardless, because 80 days had become 60, and 60 was becoming 50, and a snake bite frightened her considerably less by the middle of October than the sight of Thaddeus Pemberton's ledger with her father's note still sitting open on its page. She learned, too, over those same weeks, to work through the particular loneliness of the labor rather than around it. There was no one to talk to on that hillside most days but herself, and she found she had begun, without quite deciding to, talking half aloud to the plants themselves as she worked, a habit she would have been embarrassed to have Jubal Creech or anyone else in Cade County witness, but one that made the long, solitary mornings pass easier, and that she suspected, thinking of her own mother humming over a washpot, or her father talking low to a balky mule, was simply what any person did who spent enough hours alone with honest work and nothing else for company. She kept a small tin of cold biscuit and salt pork in her coat pocket most mornings, ate it kneeling in the leaf mold rather than walk back down for a proper dinner and lose the better part of an hour she could not spare, and came to measure the days less by the clock than by the changing slant of the thin light that made it down through the canopy, which told her better than any watch how much digging daylight she had left before she needed to start back down toward the evening's washing and curing. By the last day of October, working alone 6 days out of every 7, and losing daylight earlier with every one of them, Keziah had dug what she judged, weighing it fresh on the kitchen scale, to be somewhere near 180 pounds of unwashed, uncured root, a number that meant everything and, until it was properly dried, still meant nothing at all, because fresh ginseng root was mostly water, and Eli had told her plainly that it would lose better than 2/3 of that weight before it was fit to sell to anybody. 180 pounds of fresh root, by his rough reckoning, might yield somewhere close to 60 pounds once properly cured, and 60 pounds of properly cured root, if she got the curing right, was the difference between a farm saved and a farm lost. If she got it wrong, it was the difference between nothing at all and a winter spent wondering where she and whatever she still owned would go once Pemberton called the note. She had, in other words, dug enough. What remained, as November opened cold and gray over Bearpin Hollow, was to cure it properly, and it was in the curing, not the digging, that she came closest to losing the whole of what the fall had cost her. Eli had been plain with her, back on that first afternoon in September, about how the curing was done, and plainer still about how it was not to be done. Wild ginseng root, washed gently clean of dirt, without scrubbing away the fine root hairs or the thin outer skin, buyers valued as proof a root had never been touched by a knife, had to lose its water slowly, spread in a single unbroken layer on clean screens, in a space that was warm but never hot, dark but never damp, with air moving steadily through it day and night for as long as it took, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the size of the root and how wet the season had run. Dry it too fast, overheat or in direct sun, and the outside of the root would harden and seal itself shut while the inside stayed wet, so that a root that looked perfectly cured from the outside would, weeks later, prove to be quietly rotting from the heart outward, worthless the moment a buyer's knife or thumbnail went into it. Dry it too slow, in a space without enough moving air, and the same rot could take hold from simple dampness alone, a whole batch gone soft and dark and unsellable inside of a single humid week. Keziah built her drying screens in the loft over the kitchen, the one room in the house that stayed reliably warm from the hearth fire below without ever growing hot enough to worry her. Stretching worn cheesecloth over 4 wooden frames, She built herself from scrap lumber in the barn, propped on sawhorses to let air move freely both above and below each screen, and cracked the loft's single small window a few careful inches morning and evening to keep a slow, steady draft moving through the room without ever letting in enough damp night air to undo the good the fire below was doing. She washed each day's dug root that same evening in cold water from the spring house, working quickly and gently with her fingertips rather than a brush, laid the washed roots out in a single layer on the screens, with space enough between each one that no two roots touched, and turned every root by hand every second or third day, watching for the first roots to firm up, lose their outer moisture, and take on the pale, slightly translucent look Eli had told her to watch for. It was patient, unhurried work, exactly the kind of work the calendar sitting in her own ledger did not allow her to feel patient about, and by the middle of November, with the 15th of December less than a month off, and barely half her dug root properly through even the earliest stage of curing, Keziah made the single worst decision of that whole difficult year. She had a batch of perhaps 8 pounds of fresh-washed root dug in the first week of November that she judged wrongly, and she would understand exactly how wrongly before another 10 days had passed. She could not afford to give the full 3 or 4 weeks the rest of her curing had been taking. She moved that one batch's screen down from the loft to a shelf built close beside the kitchen hearth itself, telling herself she would simply watch it more carefully than usual, turn it more often, pull it the moment it looked done rather than wait out the full patient weeks Eli's method called for. The nearness of the fire dried the outer skin of those roots within days, giving them exactly the pale, firm look she had trained her eye to watch for on every other batch, and by the 3rd week of November she judged them cured, bagged them separately from the rest, pending sale, and allowed herself for the first time in weeks a full night's untroubled sleep. She found out what she had actually done 9 days later, when she opened that separate sack to weigh it properly into her ledger and caught, before she had even worked the drawstring fully open, a smell she did not have a name for yet, but that her whole body understood immediately as wrong, a faint, sour, cellar-damp smell that had no business coming off root she had judged, with her own careful hand and eye, to be fully cured. She upended the sack onto the kitchen table in the gray light of that November morning, and found that better than half of what she had rushed to the hearth fire had gone soft and dark at the core. The outside skin exactly as pale and convincingly dry as she remembered judging it, the inside, where it mattered, quietly rotted through in the 10 days since she had bagged it and stopped looking. She sat at that table for a long while before she could make herself do anything at all. She had lost, by her own careful reweighing that morning, a little better than 6 pounds of what would have been prime-cured root. Root that Eli's own rough estimate of a fair price would have put at somewhere close to $3 and change, which was itself a hard enough sum to lose out of a farm that could not spare 50 cents without feeling it. But the money, she understood even sitting there with the ruined root still spread in front of her, was very nearly the smaller loss. What the hearth fire had actually cost her was closer to 3 full weeks, the time she had spent digging and washing and half-curing that batch in the first place, time she did not have a single day to spare from, spent now on root that was fit for nothing but the hog trough. She walked up to Sable Fork that same afternoon, the ruined root wrapped in a cloth in her apron pocket, less because she thought Eli could somehow fix what was already rotted than because she did not, in that particular hour, trust herself to sit alone in her own kitchen with the sight of it. Eli looked the ruined root over without much surprise, turned one soft, blackened piece over in his stained fingers, and told her in the same plain, unhurried voice he used for nearly everything, that she was neither the first digger nor the last to try hurrying a fire past what the root itself was willing to give up, and that he himself had ruined a full winter's digging that way, as a boy of 16, trying to cure a whole season's root in front of his own father's hearth in a single week, because he had been too impatient at 16 to believe that anything worth doing needed to take as long as his father kept telling him it needed to take. "Sang takes the time sang takes," he told her. The same words she would remember later, that he had used almost in passing on that first afternoon in September, though she had not understood, until she was standing in his cabin doorway with a pocketful of rotted root. Exactly how much weight the sentence carried. "Rush it, and it takes your money instead of your patience. There is no cheating a root that has spent 10 years in the ground learning how to grow slow." He did not offer her false comfort about the 6 pounds, and she found, oddly, that she did not want any. What she wanted, and what he gave her instead, was simply the plain confirmation that the loss was real, that she had earned it through an understandable but genuine mistake, and that the only remedy available to her now was to go back down the mountain and do the rest of it correctly, however little time correctly seemed to leave her. She did exactly that. She moved every remaining screen back to the cold loft over the kitchen and left it there. Resisted every remaining temptation through the whole of the last cold weeks of November to move so much as a single root closer to the fire than the curing itself required, and instead simply worked longer days to make up in labor what she refused to make up in shortcuts, digging earlier, washing faster, turning the screens more faithfully, and accepting, with a calm she did not entirely feel, that some of what she had already dug would not finish curing until the very last days before the 15th of December. She wrote the loss into her ledger exactly as she wrote everything else, in her own plain hand, under a heading she titled simply, "Lost to Haste, 6 pounds, and did not allow herself, after that single entry, to spend any further time regretting it, that she could instead spend curing the rest of the crop correctly. She caught a second near mistake before it became a second loss in the last week of November, when she noticed one screen's worth of root holding a faint sourness in the loft air that reminded her, with a small cold jolt of recognition, of the smell she had caught 9 days too late back in November. She pulled that whole screen down immediately, spread the roots out further apart than she had been bothering to space them, cracked the loft window a full 2 inches wider than her usual careful few, and sat up past midnight twice that week, simply checking on it, until the sourness passed and the roots finished curing sound. Every one of them, into root she judged, examining them by lamplight every bit as good as anything from her earliest, most patient batches. She wrote that one into the ledger, too, a single line under a heading she titled, "Caught in Time," because she had decided, in the weeks since the rot, that a ledger which recorded only her losses and never her corrections was not, in the end, an honest ledger at all. It was a smaller entry than the one beside it, but she found, rereading both together some weeks later, that she was nearly as proud of the second line as she was ashamed of the first, because the second line was proof, in her own hand, that the lesson the first one had cost her had actually stayed learned. By the first week of December, with the note's deadline barely more than a week off, Keziah had moved 8 full sacks of properly cured root down from the loft to the front room, each one weighed, dated, and entered into her ledger, with 3 more screens still finishing in the cold loft above her head and a final push of late-dug root not yet even washed. 8 sacks, with more still to come, sitting in neat-weighed rows against her own front wall, was more raw, dried ginseng root, she suspected without any way yet to prove it, than anyone else in Cade County had gathered off that mountain in a single season in a very long time. It was also, sitting there in burlap and string, still worth precisely nothing at all, because she had not yet found a single soul in the whole county willing to tell her, in plain figures, what any of it was actually worth to a buyer who understood what he was looking at. The grading, once enough root had properly cured to make the exercise worthwhile, turned out to be its own kind of careful work, and Keziah spent the better part of 2 full evenings in the first week of December doing nothing else, spreading each day's cured root out across her kitchen table by lamplight and sorting it the way Eli had shown her on a visit up to check her progress in late November. The largest, oldest, most perfectly whole-forked roots set aside into what he called the prime lot. Everything smaller or lighter or broken in the digging, despite her care, set aside into a second, lesser pile. He called simply the seconds. She learned to judge age the way Eli judged it, by the length and the number of small ringed scars along the root's neck, each one marking a year the plant had sent up and then shed a single stem, so that a root with a long, deeply ringed neck had been growing under that same shade for 15 or 20 years before she ever knelt down and dug it, while a shorter-necked root might be barely old enough, at 3 or 4 prongs, to have qualified for digging at all. The oldest root she found that whole season, a heavy, deeply forked piece with a neck ringed nearly its full length, she guessed, from the ring count alone, to be older than she was. She learned, too, to test a root's cure, the way Eli had shown her, by striking 2 pieces gently together and listening for the sharp, clean, almost hollow ring of a root, dried all the way through, as opposed to the duller, deader sound of one still holding moisture somewhere near its core. A test she performed now on every single root before she let herself trust it into the prime sack, unwilling, after the November she had already lived through, to trust her eyes alone on a single piece of root ever again. She learned to prefer, all else being equal, root with a pale, almost ivory cast to it, over root gone yellow or overly dark. Another small distinction Eli attributed to soil and shade rather than to any fault of the diggers, but one he told her a careful buyer would notice and pay for, regardless of whose fault the color actually was. By the end of the second evening, she had graded and resacked everything cured so far into 2 carefully separated lots. 9 sacks she judged prime, whole and well cured and mostly large, and a smaller 3 sacks of seconds, root that was still perfectly good and perfectly saleable, but smaller or lighter, or here and there imperfectly whole from an early week when her hoe work had still been clumsy. 12 sacks in total stood against her front wall by the first Sunday of December, with perhaps 2 or 3 days of digging and curing left in her before the ground itself would finally freeze too hard to work, and she looked at that wall of sacks for a long while that Sunday evening with something that was not quite triumph yet, because triumph required a buyer, and a buyer was still the one piece of this whole undertaking she did not have. The mockery, meanwhile, had not slackened through any of it. If anything, it sharpened as the sacks against her wall grew more numerous and more obviously the product of real, sustained labor rather than some passing autumn foolishness the county could simply wait out. She heard second-hand that Jubal Creech had taken to calling her, around the store and at the Sunday meeting house both, the Renshaw witch of the Hollow, a phrase that traveled fast enough that she heard it repeated back to her almost word for word by a neighbor woman who plainly thought she was doing Keziah a kindness by warning her what was being said. At the harvest meeting held at the little log church above Tanyard Forks on the first Sunday of December, standing in the churchyard afterward with most of the upper end of the county gathered in the cold to visit before heading home, Creech made a show, loud enough to carry across the whole yard, of asking her whether she'd sold any of her weeds yet, and when she told him plainly that she had not, added, to general laughter, that he supposed the whole county would know it the day she finally did, on account of pigs flying being the sort of thing folks tended to notice. Winnie Ledford was standing near enough to hear the whole exchange, and said nothing in the moment, the same as she had said nothing in Pemberton's store back in September. But she fell into step beside Keziah as the churchyard began to empty toward the wagons and the walking paths home, and told her quietly, in the plain, unhurried voice of a woman who did not waste words she did not mean, that her own late husband had once spent 2 full seasons trying to convince the rest of Cade County that sourwood honey was worth more than the clover kind, and had been laughed at for very nearly as long as Keziah had, and had, in the end, been entirely right about it. "Takes the county a while to catch up to a true thing," Winnie said. "Doesn't make the thing any less true in the meantime." It was not much of a comfort, set against Creech's laughter still ringing in her ears. But it was, Keziah thought, walking the rest of the way home in the last of the daylight, considerably more than she had expected to receive from anybody in that churchyard that morning. Keziah had grown, over 3 months of it, considerably better at standing in the middle of that particular kind of laughter without letting her face show what it cost her. And she managed it again that Sunday, telling Creech only that he was welcome to ask her again in a few weeks, and that she would be glad to answer him plainly whenever she had a plain answer to give. She walked home from that meeting with her ledger sitting heavier in her mind than it had in weeks, not because the arithmetic had changed, but because arithmetic she was learning was only ever half of what a person needed to carry a thing like this through to its end. The other half was simply the will to keep believing a column of numbers nobody else believed in, for 1 more week, and then 1 more after that, until the numbers either proved themselves or did not. She had 11 days left until the 15th of December, 12 sacks of graded cured root standing against her front wall, and still not one single soul in Cade County who had told her, honestly and in figures, what any of it was worth. The answer came, unexpectedly, from Thaddeus Pemberton himself, 4 days after the harvest meeting, in a way that had nothing to do with any change of heart on his part, and everything to do with a letter he received that same week from a cousin of his own who kept a larger store down in Rutherford County. A letter that happened to mention, almost in passing, that a buyer working the mountain circuit for a Charleston export house was expected through the lower counties within the month, paying hard money for well-cured wild root, and paying, the cousin's letter specified, considerably more for whole, unbroken root than for the broken, carelessly cured root most mountain diggers brought in. Pemberton mentioned the letter to Keziah almost offhandedly the next time she came into the store, more as a piece of settlement gossip than as anything he expected to matter to her directly, and it was only when she asked him, carefully, what figure his cousin's letter had mentioned for whole prime root that he seemed to actually connect the question to the 12 sacks he had heard from half a dozen different mouths by then were sitting against the Renshaw front wall. He asked her, in a different voice than he had used with her all autumn, whether she might have a sample of it on her, and when she produced, from the cloth bag she had taken to carrying for exactly this reason, one of her largest prime roots, deeply forked and heavy in the hand, its neck ringed nearly its whole length. Pemberton turned it over slowly under the store's front window, in the same particular silence Keziah had noticed settle over a room more than once that autumn, though never before over anything of hers that anyone in that room actually respected. "I have kept store at this crossroads for 11 years, he said finally, still turning the root in his fingers. "And I have had mountain men bring wild sang through that door 12 times in that span, broken half to pieces most of it. Dried too quick over some kitchen fire till it was fit for nothing but a curiosity. I have never once had anyone bring me a root that looked like this." He set it down carefully on the counter, the way a man sets down something he has only just understood might be worth more than he first assumed, and asked her, plainly, how much more of it she had exactly like it. Keziah told him the truth. 12 sacks, graded into 9 prime and 3 seconds. Every root dug and cured the way old Eli Sartain had taught her to dig and cure it that whole autumn. Pemberton was quiet again for a moment, doing, she suspected, some private arithmetic of his own behind his careful storekeeper's face, and then he offered her, for that single sample root alone, a price that made her understand all at once exactly how badly she had misjudged for 3 full months what she was actually sitting on. It was not a fortune, that first offer for one root, a few cents no more, but it was more, pound for pound, than she had earned for anything else that whole desperate year, and it told her, more plainly than any letter from a Rutherford County cousin could have, that the 12 sacks against her front wall were worth taking seriously by everyone in Cade County, not only by an old man living alone at the head of Sable Fork. Word of it moved through the settlement faster than Keziah could have managed herself if she had tried. Pemberton, she learned later, could not resist mentioning to the next 3 customers through his door that Ephraim Renshaw's girl had brought him a root worth more by the ounce than good tobacco, and by Saturday the story had traveled far enough up and down the valley that 2 separate neighbors she barely knew stopped their wagons at her gate simply to see the sacks for themselves. Standing in her front room, looking at 12 burlap bags with an expression she recognized because she had worn something close to it herself back in September, kneeling in the leaf mold, trying to believe Eli Sartan's word that any of this was real. One of the 2, a soft-spoken man her father had done business with for years, asked whether she might be willing, once her own crop was sold, to walk his own place with her some coming season and tell him honestly whether he had anything worth digging on it, an offer that struck Keziah, standing in her own front room being asked for her opinion by a man twice her age who had never once addressed a serious question to her directly in her whole life, as a stranger sensation than any amount of silver was likely to produce on its own. She told him she would be glad to, once December was behind her, and noted, writing the exchange into her ledger that evening, less because it belonged there financially than because she wanted a record of it, that the shift in how Cade County regarded her had begun, in its own quiet way, well before Cornelius Teague ever rode into the settlement at all. Jubal Creech did not come to see the sacks himself, but Keziah heard within the week that he had stopped telling the pigs-flying joke around the store, which she found, turning it over privately, nearly as satisfying as anything Pemberton had said to her directly. She did not let herself celebrate any of it too openly, because a sample route and a Rutherford County rumor about a Charleston buyer were not, she reminded herself firmly, silver dollars counted onto a scale, and 11 days had already become 7, with the note's deadline sitting exactly where it had always sat, unmoved by any of the county's newly shifting opinion of her. Pemberton, to his credit, did not wait for the Charleston buyer to arrive before making Keziah an offer of his own, though it took him only a day longer to decide he would rather buy her whole stock outright, cheaply, and resell it to the circuit buyer himself at whatever margin the market would bear, than wait and watch her sell it directly and keep the difference for herself. He came to that decision, she was fairly certain, sometime between Thursday afternoon, when he bought that first sample root off her for a few honest cents, and Friday morning when he sent word up to Bearpin Hollow by a neighbor's boy asking whether she might come down to the store at her earliest convenience to discuss the balance of her crop. She walked down to Tanyard Forks that same Friday afternoon, the note's deadline now standing at 6 days and closing, and found Pemberton waiting for her behind his counter with his ledger open, his manner considerably warmer than it had been at any point since her father's funeral, and an offer already worked out in his head before she had so much as set down her basket. He would take the whole remaining 11 sacks, the 12th still finishing its last days of curing in her loft, off her hands that same afternoon, he told her, at 20 cents the pound across the board, prime and seconds together, paid in cash on the spot, note settled and closed the moment the scale finished its work. It was, Keziah understood immediately, doing the arithmetic in her head, with the same speed she had learned to do every hard sum that autumn, considerably more money than she had held in her own hand at any point since her father died, and it would, if she took it, clear the note at Pemberton's store 6 full days before it came due, with a little left over besides. It was also, she was equally certain, standing there with his ledger open between them and his offer sitting on the counter like a closed door, dressed up to look like an open one, a good deal less than what the root in her sacks was actually worth. Because a man who had turned a single sample root over in his hands 3 days before with genuine astonishment on his face did not, 4 days later, offer to buy an entire season's crop of the same root at a price that assumed she had learned nothing in the meantime about what astonishment like that was actually worth. 20 cents a pound is a fair local price for root that hasn't found its real buyer yet, she told him, keeping her voice as level as she had kept it standing in that same store being laughed at 3 months before. But you didn't offer me 20 cents a pound for that sample root Thursday. You offered me considerably better than that, pound for pound, because you'd finally looked at it properly. I mean to wait for a buyer who'll look at the rest of it just as properly. Pemberton's face did something complicated at that, somewhere between respect and irritation, and he told her, not unkindly, that the Charleston buyer his cousin had written about might not come through Tanyard Forks at all that season, might pass 3 counties south of them entirely, in which case she would be sitting on 12 sacks of root, worth exactly nothing to her, note called farm forfeit, with his own fair offer long since withdrawn. She walked up to Sable Fork again that same evening, cold and half-frightened by her own refusal, in a way she had not quite let herself feel standing in the store, and asked Eli plainly whether she had just made the worst decision of a year that had already contained one genuinely bad one. Eli, splitting kindling on his own porch in the last of the daylight, did not answer her directly at first. He told her instead that he had known Thaddeus Pemberton's own father, storekeeping at that same crossroads 40 years before, and that a Pemberton had never yet in his considerable experience offered a fair price for anything on the same day he could still hope to buy it cheap, and that the very fact Pemberton was pressing her so hard, so fast to sell to him rather than wait, told her nearly everything she actually needed to know about how much he expected the circuit buyer to pay when he finally came. As for the buyer himself, Eli told her something she had not known, and Pemberton, whether from ignorance or from calculation, had not troubled to mention. The same man had worked that mountain circuit for the Charleston house every autumn for the better part of 6 years running, always arriving somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd week of December, always working north to south through the settlement stores in almost exactly the same order, which put Tanyard Forks, by Eli's own careful reckoning, within 4 or 5 days of a visit that had not once, in 6 years, failed to happen. His name's Cornelius Teague, Eli said, setting down his hatchet. Man knows a whole root from a broken one the second it's put in his hand and pays accordingly, in silver, same as he always has. You've got 4 days, maybe 5. I'd spend them finishing that last sack properly rather than standing in Pemberton's store arguing with him further. She asked him, before she started back down the mountain that evening, what he thought her 12 sacks might actually be worth if Teague's price ran anywhere close to what a careful buyer usually paid for whole, well-cured wild root in a season when the mountain houses were hungry for it. Eli considered the question with his usual unhurried care, turned it over in his head the way she had watched him turn over a root, and finally allowed that he would not be surprised. Going by what he'd heard other diggers report over the years for prime lots as clean as hers, to see her come away with something in the neighborhood of $70 or $80 for the whole crop, prime and seconds together, though he was careful to tell her in the same breath that he had been wrong about such figures before and would rather she hear a modest guess from him than an inflated one she might spend the next 4 days quietly counting on. $70 or $80 was, by Keziah's own arithmetic, considerably more than Pemberton's flat 20 cents a pound had offered her, and considerably more, doing the harder sum in her head on the walk home, than she had allowed herself to hope for on any single morning since the frost had taken her corn in September. Keziah went home and did exactly that, spending her last 4 days before the note came due finishing out the 12th and final sack, turning and checking the last screens in her loft by lamplight each evening, and refusing, through 3 more visits from a neighbor's boy carrying fresh, slightly improved offers from Pemberton, to sell him so much as a single additional root. The last offer, delivered the evening before Teague was due by Eli's reckoning, had climbed to 30 cents a pound across the board, a full third better than Pemberton's opening figure, which told Keziah, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how much room a man like Pemberton generally left himself to move when his first offer was refused. She sent the boy home a final time with her thanks and her refusal both, banked her fire, and sat up later than she should have that night with her ledger open in front of her, 12 sacks entered in her own hand, one column of figures still waiting, after 3 months, for its final number. Cornelius Teague rode into Tanyard Forks on the 12th of December, 3 days ahead of the note's deadline, and almost exactly on the schedule Eli Sartain had predicted for him. A lean, precise man of perhaps 45 in a dark, well-kept traveling coat, with a pair of brass scale weights and a heavy ledger of his own carried in saddlebags that Keziah noticed, watching him dismount outside Pemberton's store. He handled with considerably more care than most men on that circuit handled anything at all. He had ridden that same mountain route every autumn for 6 years, buying dried root for a Charleston export house that shipped it onward, eventually, by ship, to the merchant houses of Canton, where American ginseng had been bought and paid for in hard silver. Eli had told her, since long before either of them had been born, a trade old enough that even Teague himself, when Keziah finally asked him about it directly, could only say with certainty that it went back further than his own father's time in the business. Tss. Pemberton sent word up to Bearpin Hollow within the hour of Teague's arrival, and Keziah came down the mountain with Eli beside her. She had asked him to come, and he had agreed without needing to be asked twice, telling her only that he intended to see with his own eyes what 6 years of teaching a mountain to dig properly finally looked like weighed out on a scale. The two of them arriving at the store to find that word of the buyer's visit had traveled exactly as fast as every other piece of gossip in Cade County that autumn, and that a good 15 or 20 people, farmers and their wives, and a scattering of children too young to be left home, had gathered in and around Pemberton's store on the pretense of ordinary Saturday trading, waiting, plainly, to see what would happen when Ephraim Renshaw's daughter finally opened her 12 sacks in front of a man who actually knew what he was looking at. Jubal Creech was among them, leaning in his familiar spot against the counter's far end, and Thaddeus Pemberton stood behind his own scale with an expression Keziah could not quite read, somewhere between genuine goodwill and the particular discomfort of a man who suspects he is about to watch a number appear that will make his own recent offers look considerably worse than they had seemed at the time he made them. Teague worked through the sacks with a slow, unhurried thoroughness that reminded Keziah, watching him, of nothing so much as Eli's own patient hands back in September. He opened each sack in turn, spread a double handful of its contents across a clean cloth laid over the counter, and examined perhaps a dozen roots from each lot individually, turning each one in his fingers, checking the neck for its ring count, testing the firmness of the cure between thumb and forefinger, and twice snapping a root cleanly in half to examine the color and texture of its interior, the way Eli had once told her a careful buyer always would, because a scorched or rotted center could hide behind a perfectly convincing outer skin, the same lesson Keziah had already learned once, at considerable cost, in her own kitchen in November. He said very little through the first several sacks, which Keziah found harder to bear than any amount of open skepticism would have been, and it was not until he reached the 4th of her 9 prime sacks that he finally looked up from the root in his hand and asked her directly who had taught her to cure. Eli Sartain, she told him, and I dug and cured every root in these sacks myself, on my own place, this past autumn. Teague looked past her to where Eli stood near the door, and something that was almost, though not quite, a smile crossed his careful face. I have bought root off this mountain for 6 years, Mr. Sartain, and I believe this is the first season I have ever seen your particular method taught successfully to somebody else, he said. Most diggers who claim your training haven't half the patience it actually requires. He went back to the sacks, and Keziah understood, standing there in a room gone nearly silent around her, that whatever had just passed between the two men was worth more to her in that moment than anything else that had been said in Pemberton's store all autumn. Eli, for his part, said almost nothing through the whole of the grading, standing near the door with his hat in both hands, answering Teague's single direct question, and otherwise simply watching. The way Keziah had come to understand was mostly how he moved through the world, not from any want of things to say, she had come to believe, but from a lifelong habit of letting careful work speak for itself rather than crowding it with talk. She found herself glancing toward him more than once through that long, quiet hour of grading, and each time found him watching the sacks and not her, his weathered face giving away nothing beyond the same patient attention he had given every root she had ever dug wrong in front of him that whole autumn, and she understood, watching him watch the scale, that whatever this morning proved to the rest of Cade County, it had already been proven to Eli Sartain a long time before any of them walked into Thaddeus Pemberton's store that Saturday. He finished grading a little before noon, sorting her 12 sacks finally into 2 piles on the store's plank floor. 9 sacks of prime root, whole, well-cured, evenly aged, which he set to one side almost reverently, and 3 sacks of smaller, lighter, or slightly imperfect seconds, still perfectly sound but not, by his own exacting standard, quite equal to the rest. He called for Pemberton's scale to be brought to the center of the floor, a heavy iron balance beam with a brass pan on either arm, and began weighing the prime lot first, root by sackful, calling each weight aloud for Pemberton to enter into the store's own ledger as a witness to the count. The way, Eli murmured to her quietly. A careful buyer always insisted on doing business, so that no digger could ever claim afterward to have been shorted on a weight nobody else in the room had heard called. The 9 sacks of prime root came to 99 pounds and some odd ounces on Pemberton's scale, which Teague rounded in her favor to an even 100 and named a price of 75 cents the pound for it, a figure that landed in the crowded store loud enough that Keziah heard distinctly someone behind her draw in a sharp breath. $75 for the prime lot alone. The 3 sacks of seconds went on to the scale next, weighing out at 24 pounds even, and Teague named 40 cents the pound for those, working the second sum in his ledger beside the first, $9.60. He added the 2 figures together in his own hand, turned the ledger around on the counter so that Keziah and Pemberton, and anyone else close enough to lean in and look, could see the total written plainly in his own square script, and read it aloud for the whole room besides, the way Keziah suspected he had learned, over 6 years on that circuit, was worth doing out loud rather than quietly on the particular kind of morning when a room full of people had gathered specifically to see a number appear. $84.60, he said. For 12 sacks of the best cured wild root I have taken off this mountain in 6 years of buying it. He began counting it out onto the counter as he spoke, not in paper but in silver, coin after coin ringing down onto the wood in a sound Keziah would remember, she suspected, for the rest of whatever years she had left on that hillside. 84 whole dollars in silver and 60 cents. Besides, more cash money than she had ever in her life seen gathered in one place, let alone counted out for something that had grown wild and unwanted on ground. Her own father had walked past, unconsidered, for 30 years. The store had gone almost entirely silent by the time the last coin rang down onto the counter. 15 or 20 of Cade County's own gathered close enough to see the columns of silver stacked in front of her, and Keziah heard, in that silence, the particular quality of a room full of people revising, all at once and without a single one of them saying so out loud, an opinion they had all shared comfortably for months. A child near the door asked her mother, in the carrying whisper children use when they think they are being quiet, whether that was real money, actual silver money, and the mother hushed her, but not before half the room had heard the question. Eli stood a little apart from the crowd near the stove, his hat in his hands, watching the whole scene with an expression Keziah would remember for a long time afterward. Not surprise, because he had told her from the beginning what careful digging and careful curing were actually worth to a buyer who knew the difference, but something closer to quiet, well-earned satisfaction, the look of a man watching 60 years of his own hard-won knowledge finally prove itself, in public, in someone else's hands. Keziah did not trust her own voice for a moment, standing there looking at a small mountain of silver dollars stacked in uneven columns on Thaddeus Pemberton's counter, and it was Pemberton himself, oddly, who broke the silence first, clearing his throat and remarking, to no one in particular, that he had offered this same 12 sacks 20 cents the pound not 5 days before, which by his own quick figuring came to $24.80, considerably less than half of what was presently sitting on his counter in coin. He said it, Keziah thought, less out of any real embarrassment than out of the plain, honest habit of a man who dealt in figures all day and could not help doing the comparison out loud once it occurred to him. But Jubal Creech, standing at the counter's far end with his hat pushed back and no ready joke left in him for the first time all autumn, heard the comparison plainly enough and said nothing at all. Keziah counted the note out of the pile first, $58 exactly, and asked Pemberton in front of the whole room to mark it paid in full in his own ledger, which he did, turning the book around a second time so she could watch him write the words herself. What remained after the note, $26.60, once she had done the subtraction twice, the way she did every important sum that year, she wrapped carefully into a cloth and put away in her apron pocket before she let herself look up and actually take in the room around her. Eli, watching her with something in his weathered face that was not quite a smile but stood close beside one. Pemberton, already closing his ledger with the particular satisfaction of a man whose books, at least, had come out exactly even. And near the door, Jubal Creech, who caught her eye for just a moment, opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, and then, apparently finding nothing worth saying, simply put his hat back on and walked out into the cold. Teague lingered a few minutes longer than the transaction itself strictly required, recording his own purchase carefully in his ledger, weight, grade, price, and the name Renshaw, Bearpin Hollow, entered in his neat traveling hand, and told Keziah, as he worked, a little of where her route was actually bound, information she suspected he did not trouble to share with every digger who sold to him, but offered her, she thought, out of the same professional respect he had shown Eli's method all morning. Her 12 sacks would travel with the rest of his season's purchases down to Charleston by wagon, he said, and from there by ship, along with the furs and the rest of that year's dried root out of half a dozen mountain counties, to the merchant houses of Canton, where American ginseng, though reckoned by Chinese buyers a lesser cousin of their own native root, had been wanted badly enough, for longer than either of them had been alive, to be paid for reliably in silver rather than in trade goods, the same silver that had likely crossed most of an ocean at some point in its history before it ever reached Thaddeus Pemberton's counter that Saturday morning. The whole trade moved something upward of 190 tons of dried root out of these mountains most years, he told her, more than she found she could easily picture as a number, though she found she had no trouble at all picturing the 12 sacks that had been her own small part of it. He asked her, finally closing his ledger and preparing to move on to whatever store waited next on his circuit, whether she expected to have root to sell him again the following autumn, a question Keziah answered without having to think about it at all, telling him that she had already begun a protected bed of her own near the house, seeded with berries she and Eli had saved back from the largest roots of that very crop, and that she intended, with the note now behind her, to still be digging and curing on that mountain the autumn he came through again, and the autumn after that. Teague told her, mounting back up in the cold Saturday light, that in 6 years of riding that circuit he had bought root from a great many diggers who told him something similar, and had found, more often than he would have liked, that the promise did not survive a single hard winter, but that he was inclined, watching her stand there with her ledger already back open in her hands, to believe she might prove the exception, and that he would look forward, this time next year, to finding out. Keziah paid Thaddeus Pemberton the $58 of her father's note 3 full days before it came due, a fact she noted in her ledger with considerably less ceremony than the moment probably deserved, and spent a portion of what remained over that same winter exactly the way a woman who had spent a year learning the true cost of impatience might be expected to spend it, on a proper set of curing screens built from good lumber rather than scrap, on seed corn for a fresh planting of the bottomland come spring, and on a small, careful sum set aside and given over Eli Sartain's own mild objection to Eli himself. Not as payment, she told him firmly, because she still owed him a debt no column of figures could properly measure, but as a gift between neighbors, which he was welcome to refuse if he liked, though she noted not without some satisfaction that he did not. The bed she had promised Cornelius Teague she would plant, she began that same December, before the ground had frozen fully hard, clearing a half-acre of the hollow's richest, shadiest ground closest to the house, where she could walk out to check it in 10 minutes rather than the better part of an hour, and setting into it with Eli's careful guidance, both the berries she and Eli had saved back deliberately from her largest prime roots that autumn, and a number of young, immature plants, 1s and 2s and a scattering of small 3s, that she transplanted whole with painstaking care from thinner patches elsewhere on the hollow where she judged they would do better, gathered together under her own eye than scattered thin across ground she could not watch as closely. It was not, she understood clearly, and said plainly to anyone who asked, a fortune in any immediate sense. A ginseng bed planted in December would not put a single root fit for digging into her hands for the better part of a decade, and even then only if she tended it faithfully, thinned it wisely, and resisted, every single autumn between now and then, the temptation to dig anything before its proper season. But it was, she had come to believe over one entire year of learning the hollow properly for the first time in her life, the truest kind of fortune available to anyone working ground like Bearpen Hollow's north slope. Not a single lucky season's payment, however welcome that payment had been, but a renewing thing, planted once and tended patiently, that would still be paying out, in some careful digger's hands, long after she herself was gone from the place, the same way Eli Sartain's own 60 years of careful digging had left her, on the worst morning of that whole difficult year, exactly the thread she needed to pull to save everything her father had left her. The following autumn, true to his word, Cornelius Teague came back through Tanyard Forks in the second week of December, and Keziah met him this time with 14 sacks instead of 12, dug more efficiently across a longer season by a digger who no longer needed Eli standing over her shoulder to catch her mistakes before they cost her anything, though Eli came down from Sable Fork to watch the weighing anyway. The same as he had the year before, because, he told her, a man his age took his satisfactions where he found them, and watching Thaddeus Pemberton's scale tip in her favor a second year running was turning out to be one of the better ones available to him. The price that second autumn ran a shade higher than it had the first, root having grown scarcer and the Charleston houses hungrier for it, Teague told her. A trend he expected, from what he had seen moving through 6 mountain counties for 6 years running, only to continue. Jubal Creech, for his part, never did apologize outright, not in any words Keziah could have written into a ledger under a heading anyone would recognize. But he stopped by her gate himself that 2nd November without his usual audience, and asked her, with considerably more humility than she had ever heard him use in her direction before, whether the shaded, useless side of his own place, the steep timbered ground above his own good bottomland that he had never once in his life thought to walk up with anything but an axe, might be worth a woman's trouble to look over if she had an afternoon to spare him. Keziah told him she would be glad to the following Sunday, and did not once, walking his own hollow with him that Sunday afternoon, pointing out three-pronged plants he had spent his whole life stepping past without seeing, bring up the fence rail or the pig's flying joke or the witch of the hollow, because she had learned over one long and difficult year that the arithmetic itself was answer enough, and did not require her help saying so out loud. She found herself, that second year, and increasingly in the years that followed, doing for a handful of other Cade County families something close to what Eli Sartain had done for her that first September. Walking a neighbor's shaded, supposedly worthless ground with them of an afternoon, pointing out the fan of five-toothed leaflets against the duller understory, teaching the same patient count of prongs, the same careful, wide digging, the same unhurried insistence on pressing every berry back into the same disturbed earth before moving on to the next plant. She did not charge for it, any more than Eli had ever properly charged her, though she noticed that most families found some way to send a little something up to Bearpin Hollow afterward regardless: a ham, a bushel of apples, an afternoon of a son's labor-mending fence. The same quiet economy of neighborliness her own father had lived inside his whole life without her ever quite noticing it operating until she found herself on the receiving end of it. Eli approved of the teaching more than he approved of almost anything else she did with the money itself, telling her once, watching her walk a 15-year-old girl from 3 farms over through the identification of her first mature plant, that a craft kept jealously to one pair of hands dyed with those hands. Sooner or later, the same as a wild mountain got dug clean out by diggers who never learned or never troubled to teach. The discipline of putting seed back into the ground. Keziah thought of her father's own half-remembered mention of Eli's name all those years before, and understood that she was simply doing in her own turn what somebody had once done for a stranger's benefit long before she was born, and would need someday to be done again by whoever she managed to teach it to. By the second harvest meeting that followed, the one held the December after Teague's second visit, nobody at the little log church above Tanyard Forks told any jokes at all about weeds or witches or pigs learning to fly. And Keziah found, standing in that same churchyard where she had once been laughed at loudly enough to carry across the whole gathering, that the county's opinion of her had shifted in the particular quiet way opinions actually shift, not through any single dramatic reversal, but through a slow accumulation of small, grudging acknowledgments. A neighbor asking her advice on a shaded corner of his own place, another sending his daughter up to Bearpin Hollow to learn the prong counting and the seed planting properly before she tried digging on her own, Pemberton himself, of all people, referring to her now, without any apparent irony, as one of the more careful accounts he carried on his books. She was not, by the standard the county still used to measure such things, a wealthy woman. Not in the way the term was used about the handful of families who owned the wide, sunny bottomland along the main river a day's ride east. But she owned her 113 acres outright, note paid, and she had, growing quietly under her own eye on the coldest, shadiest, least regarded corner of it, something that had taken her exactly one desperate year to learn was worth considerably more than anyone in Cade County, herself included, had ever imagined that hillside could hold. Keziah sat down with the full ledger on a quiet evening not long after that second December, the way she had sat down with it a year of Decembers before, and added the whole of it from the beginning, the way she had promised herself, that first hard morning after the frost, that she would eventually do properly, start to finish, in her own hand. $58 owed at Thaddeus Pemberton's store, the day her father died. 6 bushels of frost-ruined corn, fit only for hogs, against a crop that should have made 40. 6 pounds of prime root lost to a hearth fire she had rushed out of fear rather than patience. A hard lesson bought for a little better than $3 and 3 weeks of season both. 12 sacks, in the end, dug and cured and graded correctly. 99 pounds of prime root and 24 of seconds, weighed on Thaddeus Pemberton's own scale against Cornelius Teague's silver, and $84.60 counted out in coin for the whole of it, against a note that had once looked, on the worst morning of that whole year, like more than the entire hillside could ever be made to pay. She did not frame the number, any more than she imagined most careful people framed such things. But she did keep, on the shelf beside her own front window, where the last of every evening's light still reached it, one root from that first season she had set aside and never sold, an old, deeply forked, heavily ringed piece, the oldest she had dug that whole autumn, sitting now beside a small, unremarkable stack of silver dollars she had likewise never spent. A reminder, she told Eli once when he asked her about it, of exactly how little the truth of a thing has to do with what a county decides to believe about it on the morning they first happen to look. She was not, by the measure the distant merchant houses of Charleston or Canton would have used for the word, a wealthy woman, and did not expect to become one soon or perhaps ever from a half-acre bed of ginseng that would not properly pay her again for the better part of a decade. She was still up before light most mornings. She still lost the occasional root to her own hurry, still watched her ledger as closely in a good season as she ever had in a desperate one, because she had learned, across one very long year, that the watching itself, patient and plain and unglamorous, was most of what had ever actually separated her from a county that had once found her, kneeling in the dirt of her own shaded hillside, the easiest joke available to them. Cade County did not call her the Renshaw witch of the hollow anymore. Mostly now, they simply asked her opinion of their own shaded corners, and she gave it freely, the way it had once been given to her, for nothing more than the sight of one more unwanted hillside finally put to some patient, honest use. If a story about a mocked hillside and a fair exact reckoning is the kind of thing you enjoy, I'd be glad to have you like this video and subscribe for more. There are true-to-craft frontier fortunes like this one waiting every week, each built on a different worthless thing and a different real trade, and I promise you the arithmetic never quite adds up until, eventually, patiently, it does. Thank you for staying with Keziah's story all the way to its end. I'll see you in the next one.